From an early age, we are taught that humility is a virtue. Be modest. Don't boast. Put others before yourself. Don't speak too loudly. Don't take up too much space. In school, we're rewarded for being quiet and compliant. In religion, we're told that the meek shall inherit the earth. In workplaces, we're praised not for challenging authority, but for being a team player. And in our personal lives, we're taught that self-sacrifice is nobler than self-expression. It sounds noble. It feels moral. It even appears spiritual. But what if it's a trap? What if the very trait we've been taught to admire is what makes us easiest to control? There is a quiet contradiction at the heart of society. Humility is publicly celebrated, yet privately punished. The humble rarely rise to positions of power. They don't command attention. They don't dominate conversations. They don't break through noise. In a world that rewards boldness, confidence, and even arrogance, humility becomes invisible. Yet the paradox goes deeper. Humility is rarely treated as a personal choice. Instead, it's imposed as a standard, a rule you're expected to follow without resistance. If you refuse, you're arrogant. If you assert yourself, you're egotistical. If you claim space unapologetically, you're dangerous. So humility, over time, becomes less of a virtue and more of a performance, a socially enforced posture, designed to keep people in line. The roots of this performance run deep. In Christian doctrine, humility is elevated to divine status. Christ washed the feet of his disciples. Pride became the root of all sin. Entire generations were taught that denying the self was the only path to salvation. In Confucianism, humility was transformed into obedience, submission to elders, deference to authority, reverence for the collective above the individual. And in modern institutions, from bureaucracies to boardrooms, these moral ideals were repackaged as workplace behaviors. Speak only when spoken to. Don't challenge your boss. Stay modest, even when you know more. These traditions did not emerge accidentally. They evolved as tools for social order. Humility, in this light, becomes a behavioral technology, a mechanism for managing people, a quiet filter that separates the manageable from the rebellious. It teaches people to swallow their anger, suppress their voice, and internalize their inferiority, all while believing they are doing something noble. And when people begin to mistake silence for virtue, the systems that benefit from that silence grow stronger. This is how a virtue becomes a weapon. Consider how the humble are treated in competitive arenas. In politics, humility is a liability. Charisma wins. Dominance persuades. In corporate hierarchies, the loudest voice in the room shapes direction, not the quietest. In social media ecosystems, modesty is algorithmically punished. Humility doesn't trend. Outrage does. The entire infrastructure of modern life is designed not to reward humility, but to exploit it. And yet, the messaging persists. Be humble. Be quiet. Don't take credit. Don't assert. Play small. Keep your head down. The more these ideals are echoed, the more suspicion grows. Who really benefits when you silence yourself? Who profits from your modesty? Because behind every system that praises humility is a hierarchy that relies on it, a society that conditions people to be humble while celebrating those who defy it, creates an illusion of morality while protecting the architecture of dominance. And so, humility, stripped from its original spiritual context, becomes a psychological tool of subjugation. This isn't to say that humility is inherently bad. It's to say that humility has been taken, redefined, repurposed, rebranded, not as a path to inner strength, but as a disguise for external obedience, and the consequences are subtle, but devastating, because the more you silence yourself, the easier you are to manage. The more you shrink, the more space others can occupy. The more you defer, the more others define you. So we must ask a dangerous question. Is humility really a virtue, or is it a script we've been given to keep us from becoming dangerous? And if that's the case, then the next question becomes even darker. Who wrote the script, and why? Humility is praised as a personal virtue, a sign of character, moral integrity, inner strength. But is it really a choice? Or is it something we're trained into like a dog taught not to bark? From the moment we enter a classroom, where, given the rules, raise your hand, ask permission, sit quietly, don't question the lesson. The child who speaks out of turn is reprimanded. The one who stays quiet is praised. We learn quickly, not through reason, but repetition, that obedience is rewarded and defiance is punished. This is not morality. This is programming. The psychologist B.F. Skinner called it operant conditioning, a method of shaping behavior through reinforcement and punishment. You don't teach someone to be good. You teach them to behave. A child praised for being well-mannered internalizes that performance. A worker promoted for being easy to manage adapts their personality to match. A congregation applauded for meekness becomes addicted to spiritual approval. In every institution, school, religion, corporation, the same script is repeated. Docility is branded as humility. Conformity is reframed as kindness. And eventually, a deeper transformation takes place. The performance becomes belief. We don't just act humble. We begin to feel like we should be, and this is where the danger begins. Because when submission is learned young, it's rarely questioned later. Instead, it takes on moral weight. To be deferential is good. To assert oneself becomes arrogant. Over time, the very traits that lead to empowerment, confidence, boundaries, clarity, are cast as selfish. And the traits that lead to silence, passivity, deference, fear, are cast as virtuous. This psychological reversal doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's reinforced by culture. Nice guys finish last isn't just a phrase. It's a diagnosis. The so-called nice guy, the chronic people pleaser, isn't kind out of choice. He's kind of afraid. Fear of disapproval. Fear of confrontation. Fear of being seen as selfish or difficult. It's the fear of being disliked that turns humility into a costume. A costume worn so long we forget it ever came off. And once that fear is rooted deeply enough, people begin to censor themselves automatically. No one needs to punish them anymore. They punish themselves, hesitating before they speak, softening their words, apologizing for taking up space. It's no longer about humility. It's a reflex. This is the machinery of obedience. A system that doesn't just command behavior. It engineers the self. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of now infamous experiments. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to a stranger whenever they gave a wrong answer. As the shocks intensified, the stranger, actually an actor, screamed in pain. But most participants kept going. Why? Because an authority figure told them to. Because they were taught from the beginning that obedience is good and questioning authority is wrong. What Milgram uncovered wasn't sadism. It was something colder, the passive cruelty of ordinary people who've learned to obey. The most terrifying part? These participants weren't monsters. They were just like us, trained to defer, to comply, to trust orders over instinct. Conditioned to believe that following the rules made them good people, even if it made them complicit in harm. In this light, humility becomes a ghost word. What we call humility might actually be fear, fear of power, fear of standing out, fear of taking responsibility for one's voice. It's not spiritual. It's structural. This isn't about blaming the humble. It's about seeing how humility has been used, not as a bridge to wisdom, but as a tool of control. Because when people are taught that their strength is offensive and their silence is honorable, obedience becomes their identity. And when obedience becomes identity, no one needs to chain you. You chain yourself, so we have to ask, who benefits from this? Who gains when millions of people live quietly, ask for permission, and fear the sound of their own voice? The answer to that question doesn't just reveal the machinery. It reveals who's driving it. Power doesn't need to crush resistance. It only needs to remove the will to resist. It doesn't need force. It thrives in the vacuum left by surrender. And there is no easier prey than someone who believes obedience is virtue. Predators, whether individuals or institutions, are not always violent. Often, they are charismatic, charming, persuasive. They don't pounce, they invite. They don't demand submission, they reward it. They cloak exploitation in praise and call it harmony. In this environment, the humble are not celebrated for their integrity. They are selected for their usefulness, because the humble don't fight back. They don't question. They don't say no. They absorb. And in a world shaped by hierarchies of dominance, political, corporate, even romantic, those who absorb become ideal hosts. Humility becomes less a personal trait and more a signal. This one won't challenge me. This one won't compete. This one can be used. Power exploits the humble, not because it hates them, but because it understands them. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt warned of this dynamic in her analysis of totalitarian systems. She observed that authoritarian regimes do not survive by crushing the strong. They survive by making strength irrelevant, by encouraging submission disguised as civility, by shaping environments where the obedient appear virtuous and the disobedient are cast as threats. Nietzsche, too, saw this inversion. In his theory of master-slave morality, he argued that the powerless, unable to claim strength, rebranded their weakness as moral superiority. Meekness became holiness. Obedience became goodness. And in doing so, society elevated humility, not as an expression of depth, but as a survival tactic, a concession, a camouflage. But in today's world, the dynamic has evolved into something more sinister, more systemic. In modern capitalism, docility isn't just tolerated, it's engineered. Corporations don't want thinkers. They want team players. The ideal employee is humble, not because they're reflective or grounded, but because they don't ask for much. They don't complain. They don't resist extra hours, low pay, vague promises. They're praised for their attitude, adaptability, and loyalty. But beneath that praise is a cold calculation. They are easy to manage. The same dynamic plays out in politics. Leaders don't want citizens who challenge them. They want believers. Followers who quietly internalize slogans, accept shifting narratives, and bow before abstract ideals like duty, unity, or sacrifice, even when those ideals cost them everything. The more humble the population, the less resistance to control. Even in personal relationships, this pattern appears. The manipulative partner doesn't always seek power through aggression. Sometimes they seek the partner who always forgives, the one who stays silent in conflict, the one who says, "It's fine," even when it isn't, the one who's too humble to ask for more. And so exploitation continues, not because it is enforced, but because it is tolerated. This is the predator's paradise, a world where those most easily controlled mistake their compliance for character, a world where those who endure the kiamda, most are told they are virtuous for doing so, but there's something more chilling underneath it all. When the loud rule the quiet, when dominance becomes strategy and humility becomes weakness, the moral compass of society warps. People start believing that assertiveness is cruelty and that silence is kindness. Institutions reward the passive, not because they are better, but because they are safer. And in this landscape, the humble are not just overlooked. They are consumed. Their labor, their energy, their emotional bandwidth, all quietly extracted, while they smile and nod and call it virtue. This isn't admiration. This is extraction, systemic, predictable, profitable. And what's left of the person who always absorbs? What's left of the soul that never sets boundaries? What happens when someone has been humble for so long that they forget what it feels like to want more, to demand more, to believe they deserve more? Power knows the answer. It waits patiently for humility to do its work. And when it's done, it collects what it came for without resistance, without guilt, and without consequence. Because in a predator's paradise, the humble are not free. They're just prey. Disguised as saints, there's a silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from erasure. The kind of silence you train yourself into when speaking feels dangerous, when desire feels selfish, when identity becomes inconvenient. At first, it looks like humility. It sounds like maturity. You avoid confrontation. You downplay your accomplishments. You put others first, and the world claps. They call you wise, patient, and grounded. But what they don't see, what you don't even realize, is that piece by piece you're vanishing. This is the hidden cost of chronic humility. Not moral growth, but psychological death. Carl Jung once wrote that every personality contains a shadow, a reservoir of rejected traits, suppressed emotions, unlived truths. When humility becomes a daily posture, that shadow grows. The anger you don't express, the ambition you won't admit, the desires you repress, all of it gets buried. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit the image. And so the true self begins to fracture. This fracture is not immediate. It's slow. You lose yourself by degrees. You forget what you like. You stop asking for what you want. You avoid asserting your boundaries. Over time, you start to feel invisible, not just to others, but to yourself. Because the self that would speak, that would fight, that would reach is gone, silenced, deemed inappropriate, ungrateful, arrogant. The irony is that humility, when genuine, can be beautiful. But when it's worn like armor, it becomes something else entirely, a defense mechanism, a mask, a self-protective lie told so often it starts to feel like the truth. You're not calm. You're numb. You're not forgiving. You're afraid. You're not humble. You're vanishing, and the consequences are profound. Anxiety creeps in not as panic, but as a quiet dread. Depression emerges not as sadness, but as a kind of weightlessness, a disconnection from desire, drive, will. You feel stuck in roles you didn't choose, but can't abandon, because abandoning them would mean admitting you've been pretending. This is the spiritual wound. One talks about the soul that dims itself for the comfort of others. In mythology, we see echoes of this loss. The silenced prophet who speaks the truth but is cursed and never to be believed. The invisible servant whose labor sustains the kingdom, but whose name is never spoken. The martyr whose sacrifice is demanded again and again until there's nothing left to give. These figures were never weak, but they were expected to disappear, and they did. Quietly, tragically. That is the danger of humility without consciousness. It asks you to be small, then convinces you that smallness is moral. It praises your restraint while exploiting your silence. It rewards you for suppressing your authenticity, then punishes you when you finally speak. And worst of all, it teaches you that this is your choice, that you chose to be humble, that you want to be invisible, that you're proud of how little you need, how little space you take. But was it ever really a choice? Or was it conditioning disguised as character? The truth is, many people learn humility not as a philosophy, but as a survival strategy. They learn that being visible invites attack, that having needs leads to disappointment, that asserting truth risks isolation, so they become quiet, not by nature, but by necessity, and what begins as adaptation slowly becomes identity, until one day they look in the mirror and see only a faint outline of who they might have been. This is the death of the self. Not a dramatic collapse, but a steady erosion. Not a fire, but a long forgetting. And once you forget yourself long enough, others will forget you too. Not out of cruelty, but because you taught them how. So if you've been praised for your humility, ask yourself, do they admire your strength or your silence? Because maybe humility was never really yours. Maybe it was handed to you, wrapped in survival, masked as virtue, taught as love, and taken as obedience. Humility, we're told, is sacred, a sign of wisdom, a path to inner peace. The meek, according to Scripture, shall inherit the earth. But beneath the poetry of that promise lies a question few dare to ask. Who benefits when entire populations are taught to bow? Because humility, when institutionalized, stops being a personal virtue and becomes a political weapon. Throughout history, ruling powers have understood a timeless truth. The easiest people to govern are those who believe rebellion is immoral. And so, generation after generation, systems of control have carefully cultivated a moral framework where submission is righteousness and resistance is sin. In the early Christian texts, Jesus teaches to turn the other cheek, to give freely, to judge not. And while these teachings offer profound spiritual insight, they were also absorbed into the architecture of the empire. When Constantine converted Rome to Christianity, the same teachings that once challenged power were co-opted to preserve it. Now, obedience to the church became obedience to the state. Martyrdom was exalted. Defiance was heresy. The same can be seen across cultures. In feudal Japan, the philosophy of Zen was embraced by the samurai class, not simply for its meditative wisdom, but because its call to detachment made soldiers more accepting of death. In Confucian China, harmony was achieved through strict hierarchies. Humility was not a suggestion. It was an expectation. Defer to elders. Submit to the emperor. Silence personal desire for the good of the collective. Even today, in secular democracies, the script endures. Be humble, they say. Know your place. Assertiveness is rebranded as narcissism. Questioning is labeled aggression. The one who challenges the system is called arrogant. The one who submits is celebrated as virtuous. But humility, when repeated as dogma, becomes less about inner balance and more about outer compliance. Ideologies of meekness thrive not because they liberate people, but because they tame them. They don't tell you to abandon your chains. They tell you to love them. And what better way to prevent rebellion than to convince the would-be rebel that rebellion is prideful, that justice must wait, that the humble path is the holy path. But history shows us something different. It was never the submissive who transformed the world. It was the disruptors, the prophets who spoke when silence was expected, the visionaries who refused to bow. Yet these figures are rarely praised in their lifetimes. Jesus was crucified. Socrates was executed. Malcolm X was silenced. Joan of Arc was burned. All were painted as dangerous, blasphemous, ungrateful. And only later, long after their deaths, were they rewritten into saints, philosophers, and martyrs. The system always waits to canonize the dead so long as the living. Don't imitate them. Because humble populations don't revolt. They wait. They pray. They endure. And while they wait, The powerful rule continues uninterrupted. This is the ideology of meekness. It does not need violence to maintain control. It only needs belief. If you believe humility is always noble, then you will self-censor your anger, your ambition, your voice. You will feel guilty for wanting more. You will ask permission for what you already deserve. You will lower your head when you should raise it. But if humility can be used to suppress rebellion, then perhaps it was never as pure. As we were told, perhaps it wasn't always ours. Perhaps it was planted by kings and clergy, by empires and institutions, by voices that whispered, "Don't rise," not to protect your soul, but to protect their throne. And now the question remains, how do we reclaim humility without surrendering power? How do we be grounded without being silent? How do we resist the chains even when they look like wings? Because if humility has been weaponized, then the next step is not to discard it, but to take it back. Strip it of its obedience. Return it to its roots. And this begins not with silence, but with a confrontation. Somewhere along the way, we were made to believe that humility and power are opposites. To be strong is to be loud. To be humble is to be small. That the only way to protect your spirit is to silence your strength. But what if that's a lie? What if the deepest humility does not come from fear, but from fearlessness? We've seen how false humility becomes a performance, a tool of obedience, a mask for survival. But humility, when conscious, when chosen, becomes something entirely different. It is no longer submitted, it is presence. Not the absence of ego, but the integration of it. Not the erasure of the self, but the full ownership of it. This is where the illusion breaks. The Tao Te Ching teaches in paradoxes. He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. The soft overcomes the hard. In the Taoist worldview, strength lies not in domination, but in flow, not in control, but in balance. The river carves the mountain not with noise, but with persistence. Water bends to everything and yields to nothing. This is humility in its most potent form, not fragile submission, but indestructible grace. Carl Jung called it individuation, the integration of the shadow. The process by which we confront what we've repressed, accept the uncomfortable truths of who we are, and become whole. Humility, in this light, means acknowledging what we don't know, but also claiming what we do. It means bowing, not because we are less, but because we are aligned with something greater. It's a posture of power, not performance. In ancient archetypes, we find a forgotten template, the warrior poet. Musashi, the undefeated samurai, wrote that the true warrior does not seek battle, he prepares for it in stillness. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor with absolute power, meditated on death, frailty, and his place in the universe. These men did not shrink from power, but they did not flaunt it. Their humility came not from insecurity, but from clarity. They knew who they were. They had nothing to prove. This is the turning point. The humility of the strong, not the lion who hides, but the lion who knows it doesn't need to roar until the moment demands it. This form of humility does not ignore injustice. It confronts it calmly, clearly, unwaveringly. It does not shrink to be liked or soften to avoid conflict. It stands without apology, and when it is silent, it is not from fear. It is from mastery. To reclaim humility is not to abandon strength. It is to refine it, to wield it consciously. Because strength without humility becomes tyranny, but humility without strength becomes servitude. So we must ask the real question, how do we hold both? How do we become the kind of people who can say no with quiet confidence? Who can assert value without needing validation? Who can walk away when disrespected, not out of anger, but out of self-respect? The answer is not in extremes, not in becoming arrogant to escape weakness, not in becoming silent to appear noble. The answer is synthesis. Strength rooted in humility. Humility grounded in strength. This is what systems of power fear most, not loud rebels, but centered individuals. People who cannot be manipulated by shame, guilt, or praise. People who bow because they choose to, not because they're told to. People whose humility is real because it's no longer a cage. And what kind of world could we build with that? A world where leaders listen, but are not led by fear. Where citizens think critically, but act compassionately. Where children are taught that silence is not always good, and voice is not always ego. A world where humility is not exploited, but exalted in its true form. Because humility, when chosen freely, is the highest expression of strength. It means you don't need to prove you matter. You already know you do. The story of humility has been rewritten too many times, first as virtue, then as obedience, then as weakness. But now the page turns again, because humility doesn't need to be loud to become powerful. And rebellion doesn't always wear armor or raise its fist. Sometimes it bows, but only on its own terms. This is where the false dichotomy ends. The choice isn't between arrogance or silence, ego or erasure. There is a third path, a reclamation. Not the rejection of humility, but the awakening of it. Humility, when conscious, is no longer exploitable. It is not something you're bullied into. It's something you carry with deliberate grace. You speak, not to dominate, but to tell the truth. You pause, not to submit, but to discern. You lower your head, not because you're afraid to look up, but because you've already seen through the performance. This is the rebellion the system cannot predict, because it does not roar. It does not riot. It does not burn. It simply refuses to obey unconsciously. It is the quiet confidence of someone who knows their value and no longer needs permission to act on it. This new humility does not shrink from power, it redefines it. It does not serve authority blindly, it questions it with compassion. It does not accept suffering as noble. It confronts suffering with clarity. It says, I will not be arrogant. But I will not be small for you either. We've seen what false humility does. How it turns people into background characters in their own lives. How it silences dissent. How it rewires rebellion into guilt. But what happens when that same humility is reclaimed, owned, and made sovereign? It becomes a threat. Not because it's violent, but because it's awake. The powers that be know how to control the loud. They know how to shame the angry. They even know how to destroy the rebellious. But the one who bows by choice? The one who is silent, but only until it matters? The one who knows when to act, when to wait, when to speak, and does it not from fear, but from strength? That is the paradox the system cannot solve, because that kind of humility cannot be bribed. It cannot be flattered. It cannot be broken by exclusion or corrupted by approval. It is not looking for permission. It is looking for truth. This is your invitation. Not to abandon humility, but to refine it. To wear it like armor. You forged yourself, not chains handed to you by others. To bow when you mean it. To rise when it's time. To act not for applause, but for alignment with something deeper than praise. Rebellion doesn't always need to scream. Sometimes, the most defiant thing you can do is remain calm, clear, centered, unmoved. This is the humble rebellion, a quiet refusal to betray yourself, a graceful decision to no longer perform for approval, a steady gaze that sees through the script and says, I know who I am, and I know why I'm silent. And when you live from that place, no one can use your humility against you. No one can shape your voice with shame. No one can tame you with praise, because you are no longer participating in the illusion. The illusion that humility means invisibility. The illusion that virtue means silence. The illusion that power belongs only to the loud. The humble can be exploited until they wake up. And once they do, they become something far more dangerous than rebels. They become free.